Right. Good. It's great to be here, to be a closing speaker of this season. What I'm going to talk about today is a project that's a fairly ambitious project that has occupied me for the past 5 years or so. And as you can see from the picture I've chosen to illustrate it, it's a bit of an attempt to bring some structure and order to a field that's very interesting, lots of interesting research there, but it's still a field, evolutionary psychopathology or evolutionary psychiatry, that's still disconnected in a number of ways. And let me tell you about this. So, well, applying evolutionary insights to mental disorders, that's as old as probably Darwin. And there's been different waves of attempts to integrate psychopathology from an evolutionary perspective. It really started to take off in the 90s with some research. Some research work, some textbooks, some integrative attempts, and it's becoming more and more successful, and more people are from within psychology and within psychiatry are getting interested in this approach. Probably one of the main contributions so far in general of an evolutionary approach is to unpack the whole concept of a mental disorder and revealing that what we call disorders, or I'm calling in this case kind of undesirable conditions, can actually be a wide number of different things, and you range from pure dysfunction, so some mental or brain process actually stops working as intended, you have some breakdowns in the machinery, and the spectrum covers a whole lot of other possibilities, those, from mismatches between some evolved adaptations and the current environment. A lot of mechanisms, even when they function properly, they can have maladaptive outcomes or dysfunctional outcomes occasionally that may actually be built in the system to some extent. And lastly, some strategies, behavioral strategies that are actually adaptive from biological perspective might also be construed as disorders because we don't like some of the outcomes. For example, some strategies that are socially exploitative or undervalued in some social contexts for various reasons. So that's, and people have been proposing and testing a multitude of different models of specific disorders based on hypotheses of this kind, from dysfunctional hypotheses, adaptive hypotheses, and everything in between. There are some limitations, though, and what I think are the main limitations of the field at this point in time are, well, first, models of specific disorders are, as a rule, kind of disconnected. Okay, you have specific models of schizophrenia, a lot of different models of depression, and even if there's a lot of overlap and connections between disorders, the models themselves tend to be pretty isolated, not well integrated. There's also limited integration with developmental psychopathology, which is also a flourishing approach, where you're looking not just at disorder as it manifests in adults, but how it develops, what the developmental precursors are, what the trajectories are, and how, for example, different types of symptoms morph into one another or change across development. The field has no models of comorbidity and no model of the large-scale structure of mental disorders. And that's a particularly bad limitation because mental disorders have a lot of structure. Actually, comorbidity is the rule rather than the exception. You don't get one mental disorder. You're lucky if you get one mental disorder. People with one diagnosis actually have, the rule is kind of 50% chance of having a second one, and those who have two have another 50% chance of having three. So disorders tend to cluster. And people tend to get constellations of symptoms, not clear-cut DSM diagnosis. And the whole thing actually has some pretty strong structure there. So evolutionary psychopathology has done a lot to understand or try to explain specific symptoms and disorders, not a lot to explain why things hang together the way they do. And related, there's no alternative from an evolutionary perspective to the standard classification systems. And everybody complains about the DSM and other attempts at classification, but there's no alternative proposal that is workable and at the same time based on evolutionary ideas. So this is where I'm trying to start, and what I'm proposing today is a way of approaching psychopathology from this kind of high-level perspective that, in my opinion, make some progress toward all of these goals at the same time, plus other additional benefits. And the idea here is essentially to use some broad concepts from life history theory to organize a functional model of individual and sex differences. And the whole idea, this is not, this idea in particular is not new. There are other approaches in psychopathology that do the same. The idea is that you understand the structure of psychopathology starting from a model of normal individual differences, which includes personality, cognitive traits, cognitive phenotypes are going to be involved as well, and neurobiology, of course, you want to link that too. How do you do that? That's the tricky part. So the approach I've taken is to try to be as general as possible, start as general as possible, and use the very broad distinction between fast and slow life history strategies as one organizing framework for individual differences. And you see how that works. Standard ways of applying life history models to human behavior have also some limitations. So part of what I'm doing in this model for psychopathology is also try to extend and refine the standard approach in a number of ways. So I'm going to start from this. Once you have a workable provisional model of life history strategies in humans and the psychological traits that go with them, you can actually try mapping mental disorders on this space you create based on functional criteria. And well, you have to keep in mind that there are multiple etiological pathways, so same disorder, same symptom actually arise for very different reasons. There's going to be both adaptive and maladaptive conditions in there. So I'm saying this because one reaction I sometimes get is that because I'm using this adaptive framework to describe the structure of psychopathology, some people assume that I'm also arguing that all mental disorders are also adaptive. That's very far from what I'm doing. So the structure is one thing, and then in there you have all sorts of pathways, some of which are frankly dysfunctional and maladaptive, actually probably a majority of them. Then I'm adding some criteria that are not strictly based on life history concepts that have to do with the regulation of defenses. And by defenses, I'm not talking about Freudian defenses, but more about mechanisms that protect you from social threats, physical threats, so fear, disgust, those motivational systems. They're also very important dimension that organizes psychopathology. And you can use those criteria to make functional predictions about epidemiological risk factors, patterns of sex differences, and so forth. And if the trick works, you can actually unify a lot of disconnected knowledge about mental disorder in a way that actually makes sense from a theoretical standpoint. So what I'm doing with this, I'm proposing a very broad taxonomy of mental disorders as, of course, a first approximation. It's a three-way taxonomy in which the distinction is between fast, slow spectrum disorder and defense activation disorders. We'll talk more about that later. And I'm using these criteria to do two interconnected things. One is to make sense of the comorbidity structure. So why do some disorders go together and occur together within individuals, but also within families, for example, okay, the way they do. And I'm also doing something else, which is see if you can use this criteria to identify subtypes within single diagnostic categories that are actually more coherent from this standpoint. And everybody knows that a lot of standard DSM categories are actually heterogeneous. You take autism spectrum disorder, schizophrenia, depression. There's clearly heterogeneity in there. Probably different conditions with different etiologies, different functional correlates. However, there's also many, many different ways of slicing things up and try to divide them. You can do it with, based on symptoms, symptom flavors, based on developmental patterns. People have tried a bunch of different approaches. And the attempt here is to see if by using these functional criteria, you can make sense of subtypes within disorders in a way that makes sense and helps you predict things like developmental patterns, sex differences, and so forth. All right, this is the approach. So I'm going to give you a very short summary of the concept of life history strategies. And this will be a cartoonish version of it, but just to get some terms some shared background. So the basic problem life history theory deals with is how organisms allocate resources among competing fitness components. So you have some energy you harvest from the environment, you have some time also you can allocate between different activities, and different things will contribute to fitness in different ways, and trade-offs arise. So you can put energy in somatic effort, so growing a larger body, maintaining your body, immune function, or you can use energy to produce offspring. So it's reproduction versus somatic effort. Reproduction turns out to be not an entirely straightforward thing because then, especially if you're a sexual species, you have mating. So that takes time and energy too, and parental investment is detracting from that. So you have to allocate between mating and parenting too. Scheduling reproduction in early, so reproduces as early as you can. Rather, you can wait and accumulate, for example, a larger body, more skills, or more resources. That's also a trade-off. And then quantity versus quality has to do with the allocation of the energy into large number of offspring of, let's say, lower quality in terms of maybe survival or investment in other traits versus quality of offspring. And that's, of course, these trade-offs are not completely independent from one another. Parenting in a lot of species actually tends to increase the quality of the offspring and so forth. And if you look across species, there's definitely a kind of strong empirical pattern people are finding that has been described as the fast, slow continuum of life history strategies. And you have some organisms that have short lifespan, fast growth. They tend to reproduce and mature early, have more offspring, and do less parenting effort, and then on the other side you have the opposite pattern. And there's a number of things, actually several things we don't understand precisely about life history evolution, but one thing that's a reasonable assumption is that, for example, environments that are highly dangerous, unpredictable, and there's high mortality risk, you can't control, they tend to promote faster life history. So you want to reproduce earlier, and it doesn't make as much sense to invest a lot in the quality of offspring because there's a lot of random mortality around. It's difficult to predict how the environment will look like in a while. So you shift the trade-offs on one side. And then safe, stable, predictable environment, they tend to train the opposite kind of strategies. And these has been, there's a whole tradition of studying this at level of species. There's also the idea that you can use some of the same concepts, and there's some complexities, but adapting the same concept to explain individual variations within a species. And you will see that individuals are not always all the same, and some of them will, for example, reproduce earlier than others, invest more in parenting, have some more aggressive investment in mating, and so forth. And the logic, essentially, is that trade-offs entail behavioral traits and physiological traits. So life history trade-offs don't stay confined to demographic parameters, but have cascading effects. So if you're, let's say, an organism you want to do mating, invest a lot of mating effort and current reproduction, well, you're better not take too long to become sexually mature. You probably, to the extent that your mating system allows, for example, some pair bonding or some kind of mating sexual motivation, you want to shift those behaviors a little bit, so maybe have more willingness to mate and possibly less investment in kind of long-term bonding. Risk-taking is going to be a necessity, and might in turn affect things like aggression and competition, for example, for dominance and mating competition of various sorts, but also exploration in a number of ways. So you can see the cascading effect of the standard life history trade-offs. And of course, for example, if you're you have to decide how to allocate resources to immunity, tissue repair, and other somatic investments. There's reason to assume that if you're going to reproduce early and invest a lot in mating, you're probably going to lower the investment in that because you're less concerned with the long-term integrity of your body and reproductive system. And if it works, again, as a first approximation, it's a really nice way to explain covariation, not just between behavioral traits and motivation, but also growth patterns and some aspects of physiology. So this is why people are getting excited about it. And in humans, for example, you have some trait like maturation timing and rate, risk-taking, impulsivity, and a number of traits have to do with mating, but also cooperation, reciprocity, and you can make some rough prediction about how those traits will cluster depending on these broad strategies. This is not just limited to humans. There's a whole area in non-human behavior trying to make sense of, again, coordinated variation in growth, physiology, and behavioral differences using this kind of fast, slow heuristic. And again, things don't necessarily look exactly this. This was one of the early papers. And then people are finding that each species, in a way, makes, there's differences there. So some of the general predictions only hold up in some species. There's a lot of complexity there. You really want to understand the ecology of a certain species before you understand how the trade-offs are managed. But this is the general idea, and this is the kind of the prize. The ultimate prize of this approach is it gives you some heuristics to correlate not just behavioral traits, but growth, physiology, and development. Okay, so let me, I don't know if you're familiar with human applications of this in psychology. So what people are doing, they're trying to, for example, make sense of personality variation, personality trait. There's descriptive models of that. And you can try to make sense of variations in personality between people based on this kind of scheme. And generally, the tendency has been to try to reduce a lot of traits to basically one big fast and slow dimension and aggregate a lot across different domains, and including health and other traits. So what I'm suggesting is a slightly different approach, and I'm going to explain this to you shortly. And so from now on, what I'm presenting is not in published papers, but is going to be published in a book that hopefully will be out within the next year or so. It's almost finished. So humans have some really interesting features, and you can call them, this evolutionary innovation that really changed the dynamics of some life history decisions. And one important feature is dual status hierarchies. And this is usually known as dominance versus prestige. It turns out to get social status and good mating opportunities, you don't necessarily have to compete physically for dominance. Okay, you can do other things. For example, become really good at doing something that's useful to people, or becoming, really you can do arts. You can do, becoming interesting in a number of ways, or good at some kind of technical skill or knowledge, or that is an alternative route to status that is really kind of unique to humans. And it creates two offshoots that really have to do with the way you think about life history allocations. And one is that, well, if you're going for mating effort, let's say you have individual differences in the amount of, let's say, investment allocated to mating, so finding mates and possibly having, a higher number of sexual partners rather than a stable monogamous relationship with one or few. The thing is, you don't necessarily have to be aggressive and physically dominant. You can also invest a lot in courtship. And one thing that the humans do that's a big component of courtship is creativity. Lots of manifestation of creativity can actually be read in this context. It becoming an interesting, kind of fascinating, seductive kind of person. And the personality trait that tends to go with that is some aspects of what's called openness to experience. The imagination phase especially has to do with your interest and appreciation of aesthetics, your creative interest, and whether people like to do things like playing instruments and writing poetry, or and actually predicts things like number of sexual partners and mating success. So it's definitely working. On the other hand, there's a whole other area, okay, that's part of our competition for status that has to do with technical skills. In stratified societies, lots of niches, lots of specialized occupations. Well, being good at doing something technical, which includes knowledge as well, that's actually can be rewarded quite a bit. You can get a lot of status for being good at doing something. And this kind of trait actually doesn't require a lot of imagination as defined by personality psychologists, okay? And people who are very good at technical kind of proficiency and even creativity, they're not especially high in these traits. Actually, might interfere a little bit. Okay, and what's the kind of trait that's the cognitive trait that support technical proficiency? Simon Baron-Cohen famously call it systemizing. So the ability to understand, how system works, how rules work, how you can figure out the mechanics of natural and social systems, and that a different way of kind of getting there. And this ties into another innovation, which is transfer of resources across multiple generations. And that also makes a whole lot of difference, for sure. People are not, I think, exploring all the implications of this. And I'm just, hinting at it, but I'm starting to consider what changes when you can actually, you don't necessarily have to do all your parental investment in the here and now, but you can, for example, transfer resources. And some of those resources are not just going to increase the success of your children, but also that if it's land, houses, cattle, you can actually increase the reproductive success of multiple generations at once if you collect enough of those. So the thing is, indirect parental investment is definitely a thing in humans. So you can do provisioning even across multiple generations without engaging in a lot of direct parental care. Inheritance and wealth, and that ties, I think, nicely in the pathways towards, say, let's go to technical skills, because you can think of a kind of there's a pathway toward high parental investment in humans that doesn't really go through direct caregiving and nurturing traits and agreeableness and so forth, but really goes through developing good technical skills and providing through indirect means, so accumulating status and wealth and passing them down. Again, this is kind of a cartoonish version of what's happening, but just keeping those 2 points in mind helps you figure out the idea that within the general idea of fast and slow strategies, there's actually multiple ways to get to the same basic allocation decisions. So you can invest a lot in mating effort. There's actually at least 2 ways of doing it. One through dominance competition, one through courtship. If you want to do parental investment on the other side, well, there's a kind of nurturing parent way to parental investment. There's also the indirect kind of provisioning through building technical skill and prestige instead of dominance again. So here's the way I'm putting it together. So this is the standard, what I'm calling kind of the basic model of life history traits, life history related traits in humans. And this is what you find in most of the literature. A, C, and H, for those unfamiliar. So A would be agreeableness, C is conscientiousness, another important personality traits that has to do with future orientation and persistence. And H is a factor called honesty, humility, that, well, you understand what it is. So this is basic model. On the fast end, you have, impulsivity is a key trait, defining trait here. More risk-taking, sensation-seeking, unrestricted social sexuality, and less long-term orientation and bonding and affiliation and cooperation. So it's basically a kind of exploitative attitude that's present-oriented. On the other side, you have, low impulsivity, long-term orientation, stable attachments, and a lot of affiliation, cooperation, and kind of empathy. This is the basic idea. Well, what I'm arguing is that this constellation of traits is actually one subset of behavioral profiles that can be framed as fast life histories in humans, and it is what I would call an antagonistic exploitative kind of profile. But you have a different profile, which I'm calling seductive creative, in which theoretically you can think of people who actually do, more courtship. And less direct status competition. You're not as aggressive. You can be more verbally creative. Openness to experience and imagination contribute to this. And to do the kind of courtship that we do, theory of mind, mentalistic cognition is actually a very important asset. And the idea here is that if you want to start linking it to some traits that border between normal and pathological variation, you can link the above traits. The representative trait is psychopathy. A psychopath is really impulsive, disagreeable, present-oriented, and exploitative. That's the prototype. But on this side, you have, for example, narcissistic traits that don't correlate, for example, as strong with aggression. But they do correlate with these other traits over there. The schizotypal traits have always been linked, so these kind of I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they are, let's say, low-level psychotic experiences, kind of magical thinking, tendency to experience kind of hallucinatory perceptions, to be a bit paranoid about things, thinking that people can sometimes read your mind, that kind of trait. And they also correlate with all those things and tend to predict more investment in mating, more sexual partners, and so forth. On the other hand, on these low strategies, again, on the top, you see this, what I'm calling pro-social caregiving profile. But on the other hand, I'm proposing there's a functionally equivalent in many ways, but behaviorally different profile, which I'm calling skill provisioning, where what you do essentially is to build skill proficiency through not mentalistic skills, but mechanistic cognition, so systemizing, less affiliation, less agreeableness, and you don't need imagination, that kind of imagination measured by openness to experience. And if you want to know what I'm thinking about, so autistic-like traits, which I'm sure are completely not represented in this room. Okay, scientists don't have autistic traits, right? Those kind of personality and cognitive traits actually tend to do those things. So more mechanistic skills, not a lot of social facility. You're not as socially exciting as other folks, but it's actually a very good way to build specialized skills. And I'm telling you something more about the correlates of these traits in a second. There's no label, if you're noticing, on the top right quadrant, because it was a pro-social caregiving. What's there? Well, there's no. The thing is, that's basically what psychologists think everyone should be. Okay, that's just what you should be. Just kidding, but there's a strong assumption in psychology that that is the kind of optimal kind of behavioral profile. So deviations from that tend to be labeled as pathological, even if they may or may not be. And there's actually some healthy debate about whether it is the case. You can start correlating some of those big traits and profiles to some neurobiological patterns. And again, the evidence there is really far less robust than one would like, but I'm trying to start making some connections, still tentative. But serotonin, for example, serotonergic activity seems to be the best candidate for correlate of as low life history in terms, the inhibition, future orientation, and other interesting things. And these two kind of new profiles I'm describing, seductive creative profiles, you can expect based on the constellation of traits, for example, a higher activity of the oxytocin system and, for example, higher activation of some brain networks that have to do with theory of mind and reasoning about mental states and so forth, and the opposite on the other hand. And then you can try to make, again, it gets even trickier, but you can start at least making some rough predictions about patterns of dopaminergic activity, sex hormones, and stress physiology, which I'm also very interested in. So this kind of scheme gives you a interface to start linking not just behavioral traits and some cognitive traits, but also some neurobiological differences between people. All right, how do you get from here to psychopathology? And here I'll try to be very brief, but what you're looking at is that some outcomes that you label as disorders, whether they're disorder in the strict sense, meaning there's a dysfunction, or just conditions we want to get rid of or we don't like in other people. And there's clearly multiple etiological pathways you get disorders. And what I'm proposing is that basically what life history-related traits do is to set the stage for a number of those pathways to happen. Another very important thing that goes into the causal pathway toward disorders is the regulation of defenses. Lots of negative emotions and psychological processes, you can think of them as defensive systems, so anxiety, fear, disgust. And the way they are regulated, the threshold for activation, the intensity of activation, that's going to affect your risk for different conditions. And there's going to be some interesting functional relations between the two. So briefly, so how do those traits, those general traits that are adaptive, so life history-related traits and defense regulation, by and large, this is adaptive variation between people and between males and females. How do you get from there to disorders? Well, one thing that can happen is actually it's some adaptive traits may be regarded as symptoms. So psychopathy, there's good reason to think that at least a subset of it is not dysfunctional. It's just the way these people are kind of designed to function, even if they're making everyone else miserable. Aversive defenses sometimes are just framed as, Randy Nesse has written a lot about this, sometimes defenses are kind of misunderstood as disorders. And in medicine, the analogy would be, for example, vomiting, and just thinking that vomiting is, this is a disease. It's not a disease. It's a way that your body has to get rid of some toxins and so forth. And of course, it can grade into disease, but it's not a disease itself. And this is where we're going with the second point. So sometimes adaptive traits get expressed at maladaptive levels. Maybe some genetic, confluence of genetic factors, some environmental factors, the combination of the two. Well, assortative mating is one of the things that creates this. Two people high in an adaptive trait, they can actually push it in the offspring beyond the adaptive range. And for mental disorders, actually, we start to get better information about assortative mating. And for some disorders, it's actually pretty high. For example, there's a few disorders where the assortative mating is actually in the 0.5 range. It's really, really high. We're getting new data on that. So it has implication for genetic studies too. Well, adaptive strategies might yield individually maladaptive outcomes, even when they're functioning in the kind of the intended way, in the optimal way. Sometimes, well, high-risk strategies by definition have some negative outcomes. Otherwise, they're not high risk. So that's one thing that can happen. Or defenses, well, they might be regulated so as to sometimes just make errors. Probably more false positives than false negatives. And so sometimes you can have activation of a defensive system like anxiety, and there's nothing to really be anxious about, but the system is designed to accept some probability of error. Finally, and that's going to be a whole, this is a huge, the fourth point is actually probably, in my opinion, a huge contributor to this kind of large-scale organizational psychopathology. Some adaptive traits might actually not do anything direct to increase your chance of getting mental disorder, but increase your vulnerability to some specific dysfunctions. So let's say because of your individual, where you are in the individual differences space, you might have, say, a very sensitive or very active dopaminergic system. Well, that's, good as it goes. Their chances are it also makes you more vulnerable to dysregulation in that neurobiological system. So anything happens that interferes with dopaminergic signaling, well, in other people it does nothing. In you, you're already kind of in a kind of risk zone, it's pushing you over the edge. So that's and any kind of let's say disturbance can do that, from deleterious mutations, pathogens, chronic stress, and so forth. A lot of pathways through psychopathology seem to be affected by these kind of non-specific factors, like early stress, exposure to trauma, infections in utero, things like that. And one possibility is that depending on your background of general overall patterns of variation, those disturbances may actually push you in one direction or the other. And this is where it gets to classification of disorders. This was my original, I published a few papers based on this initial classification scheme, and it had just very simple structure. You have what I call fast spectrum versus low spectrum disorders. And I won't go into detail because we're going to talk about those more. But so one limitation of this, you can actually make sense of some interesting patterns. The main limitation of this kind of classification, I think, is that there are some conditions that really don't seem to be functionally associated with fast-related traits versus slow-related traits. They seem to be pretty independent. Maybe they change a little bit depending on the background, but I call them non-specific in these papers if you happen to read them. As it turns out, all those kind of non-specific conditions, the core symptoms of those conditions have to do with the activation of defensive mechanisms. So OCD, there's a case to be made that OCD reflects some kind of security motivation system or hazard prevention system. There's some disgust in there too. Depression, of course, is kind of prototype of an evolved defense and anxiety. So one thing I'm doing in the revision of this taxonomy for this bigger book project is I'm actually, adding one dimension here. So instead of a two-category system, now it's a three-category system in which you still have fast spectrum, or I'm looking for better than before, and adding a functionally separate dimension, which I'm calling defense activation disorders, where it's not just that you have some activated defenses, but the core symptoms of the disorders really are manifestation of defensive systems like anxiety, disgust, depression, and so forth. And those defense activation disorders, the commonalities are, they're all marked by high neuroticism. Okay, so negative emotionality, emotional lability. In neurobiological terms, you find, for example, that reduced activity of GABA signaling is also widespread in these kind of disorders. And then you find some correlation with amygdala size, some activity patterns in the amygdala. So there are, again, some interesting correlates that have to do with the readiness to respond and the intensity of response to threats. And they can be physical threats, they can be social threats, and the way people work, there actually seems to be a correlation. So people tend to have some general settings for that, which is reflected in neuroticism. So the idea here is, what is this model good for? The idea here is to identify broad clusters of comorbidity in which disorders and conditions have similar functional correlates. Within, for example, if you take fast spectrum or F-type disorders, now in this extended model, you can start to discriminate between different profiles within there. So within big clusters, so disorders that cluster with impulsivity and early sexual debut and so forth, you can probably, if this model is correct, you can identify two smaller clusters that go with, for example, high openness and creativity versus more physical dominance and aggression. And then D-type disorders, the defense activation disorders, the idea here is that they may actually occur at both ends of the continuum, so there's no strong specificity here, because there are reasons, if you're a fast strategist, you're probably going to face quite a bit of danger and challenges, so there's conditions in which it's a good thing to have sensitive defenses. But if you're a slow strategist, for example, having sensitive defenses is useful, for example, to preserve your somatic investment from threats. Even if there's not many threats around, prevention is better than dealing with a threat after the fact. So for different reasons, people with different strategies may actually invest quite a bit in defense activation. At the same time, there's reasons to expect slightly stronger overlap with the F-type disorder. And part of the reason is that the kind of environmental context that will favor one disorder or another, the idea is that, again, going back to the general concepts I described before, fast spectrum disorders should be more common in high stress contexts. There's going to be a lot of genetics there too, so it's not all environmental at all. But when you look at a broad epidemiological pattern, you expect more of these disorders in high stress contexts, so low SES, lots of traumatic events, and so forth. And the opposite actually for low spectrum disorders, which is kind of interesting because it's counterintuitive to a lot of psychiatric research, where you find this kind of non-specific factor like low SES, traumatic events, bad things correlate together and predict all sorts of disorders. This model makes the prediction that some disorders will actually be more common when the environment is very stable, very safe, and nothing bad happens to you. Defense activation disorders, again, you can make predictions at both sides, but in high stress contexts, you definitely need more of that. And there's some process like sensitization of defenses, so the more threats you encounter, the more you can become sensitive to those threats. You can make a general prediction that even if it overlaps with both categories, it's probably going to be even more common, the comorbidity with F-spectrum, with F-type conditions compared with S-type. This is the general model. You can also use the functional criteria that define these strategies and profiles to make some principal prediction about sex differences, which is also kind of useful. So for example, you can predict that defense activation disorder will be higher in females in general, just because of the cost-benefit analysis of taking risks is just different, and so any kind of defense is going to pay off more in females, even if it costs more. And for example, something like the antagonistic exploitative kind of profile, you can expect it to be higher in males. Not a lot of differences in the seductive creative pattern, because courtship is pretty bidirectional. Although you can expect males to have the worst version of the disorder because they're just more variable on pretty much all sorts of traits. And then for on the slow spectrum, you can expect more females than males in the pro-social caregiving kind of cluster, and more males again in the skill provisioning. Again, for reasons that don't, you can actually make these predictions based on who's doing what in human societies and who gets the best payoffs from things like investing in, for example, indirect provisioning versus direct caregiving and so forth. So this is what the model does for you. And this is just briefly a list of the markers you can use to take a disorder, look at the literature, and see if the constellation of traits that go with that disorder actually fit one of those areas or one of those clusters. And there's some, lots of overlap. There's some things like, again, precocious sexuality. This is kind of repeating what I showed in the other figure. But you can use the traits associated with fast and slow profiles to do some pattern match, some template matching for disorders and see what to do. Sometimes, by the way, for some disorders, these correlates are more readily evident, not in the disorder itself, but for example in relatives or people with kind of the mild version of the traits. Just one example for all. Schizophrenia spectrum disorders. Okay, so people with high levels of schizotypal traits but no diagnosis, they tend to be high in imagination and openness. Relatives of schizophrenic patients also tend to be high in openness and creativity and imagination. The patients are lower than average, probably because there's also some severe brain dysfunction going on at the same time. So how you map those traits on disorders have to be done with some care. So sometimes it's not the disorder itself, but the constellation of personality and cognitive traits. So there's a lot of interesting work to be done. And this is the same thing for slow spectrum disorders. How do you map the DSM categories in this model? Here is again my proposal. We don't have time to go into the detail of this, but let me attract your attention to a couple of things. So on the fast side, what you get essentially is antisocial conduct disorders. That's not news. The psychosis spectrum, narcissistic personality, and borderline personality. All those disorders have constellation of traits that definitely place them on this side of the spectrum. On the other side, you get autism spectrum disorder. This is a subtype of that, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Obsessive-compulsive personality, and then you see that some disorder actually, I'm placing some subtypes of them on one end of the spectrum and other subtypes on the other end. And this is the second goal of the classification like that. It's not just taking existing categories and placing them on this space, but also sometimes looking into a category and see if you can actually subtype what's going on in that disorder based on these criteria. And for example, eating disorders, ADHD, and also obsessive-compulsive disorders, there's actually grounds I'm arguing to identify distinct functional clusters within there that map on those dimensions here. And of course, on the defense activation cluster, you have depression, anxiety, PTSD, panic and phobias, and a subtype, probably a prevalent subtype of OCD. So that's the way I'm proposing to take the DSM categories. Some of them are good as they are, and you just kind of place them. And for other categories, there's some interesting subtyping to do. So there's a bit, you make lumpers and splitters happy or unhappy to the same degree, okay? Some people are like, why are you splitting disorders? And some people are like, oh, why are you lumping it? Okay, it's not just a lumping approach, it's not just a splitting approach. You're using this criteria to do two things at the same time. And then there's, in the middle down there, some subtypes of some disorders that don't really fit any of these distinctions here. And in particular, some clusters of ADHD and autism spectrum disorders that I'm arguing that have nothing to do essentially with variation in either life histories or defense activation, and they're they have some characteristics, and I'm going to explore that in a minute too. Two quick examples. So first, eating disorders. Okay, it's a kind of successful model in evolutionary psychopathology called the sexual competition model. And the idea is that what's driving eating disorders is competition for thinness as a cue of youth and reproductive potential. And there's ideas about special social dynamics that might promote this kind of runaway competition with a kind of mismatch. And there's quite a bit of evidence supporting this. So robust associations between eating symptoms and things like intersexual competitiveness, mating motives, and so on. So there's support for that. However, some limitations too. And historically, you see that, well, there's quite a bit of cross-cultural evidence, for example, that if you look at saints in the Middle Ages, there's a whole cluster of, for example, anorexia, in which main motivation doesn't seem to be mating, but quite the opposite. It's kind of some moral, ascetic motives. And then even the contemporary data show that status competition, perfectionism, they're also not necessarily associated with mating competition, but they play a role in some kinds of eating symptoms. And well, what I'm again proposing is that here we probably have multiple mechanisms and multiple motivation that can basically feed into two main vicious circles that lead you ultimately to eating disorders. And one is the binging, purging cycle. The other one is the I call it self-starvation cycle. And once you get into the cycles, you may actually get trapped in them. But how you enter the cycles may actually depend on a bunch of different motivations and initial starting points. And that idea actually fits very well with one problem in studying eating disorders, that standard categories are very unstable. The DSM distinguishes between bulimia, binging, purging, anorexia, restrictive anorexia, but patients don't just stay in that category. And what you have, this is one empirical study. Different colors are different diagnoses, okay? And followed in time across 7 years. And you see most patients actually change diagnosis over time. And there's a general tendency from anorexia to bulimia, if you want to, just broad. But there's a lot of back and forth, and some patients keep switching between one and the other. So if you look for correlates based on the symptoms, you probably don't expect to find anything robust, because symptoms change even in a few years or even months sometimes. And so there's a very promising approach in psychopathology that's been to find personality subtypes associated with eating disorders that can correlate with different types of symptoms at different times. And what people have described is this called under control subtype, which is mostly related to binging, purging symptoms, where you have impulsivity, externalizing, blah, blah, blah. And over control subtypes where neuroticism and conscientiousness are strong, and there's a lot of perfectionism and low self-esteem. And then so-called high functioning, which is again can be called the high functioning type. You find that in basically all types of diagnoses. It's not very specific, and the characteristic of these profiles are basically low comorbidity, so not a lot of, say, depression, anxiety disorders, and high agreeableness and conscientiousness. So I'm basically starting from here, and it turns out if you fit those personality subtypes within the life history model, it actually works fairly well. And this is the classification I'm proposing. So based on this three-way model, I'm basically arguing that the under control subtype of eating disorders is a fast spectrum condition where the main driver is, one of the main drivers is mating competition, especially for the short-term mating. One specific kind of attractiveness, and which fits better, by the way, with binging, purging symptoms than anorexic symptoms. You can see the gradient of the arrows up there. And then you have as low spectrum eating disorders, which range from the over-control to the high functioning, in which the main thing is constraint, high conscientiousness, and desire to, in some subtypes, to please other people, to conform to other people. You don't find any of the impulsivity and aggressive symptoms you find in the other subtype. And one component of that is actually competition for moral status. Okay, moral competition for status, which might actually, for example, manifest itself in, a pathway to eating disorder that goes through I like the English word at this moment. Basically, renouncing food and being pure, in a sense, kind of aspiration to purity, that really fits with that constellation of traits. That explains more correlation you find between putative life history indicators and eating disorders. But it also gives you some new insight in some of the neurobiological findings. And one of the findings, for example, if the serotonin, well, serotonin is low in bulimia, so bulimic patients tend to have low serotonin. It's also low in anorexic patients when they're in the acute phase. But when you look at recovered anorexics, they are actually higher than average. They have higher serotonin level than average. And what I'm proposing is that the high serotonin of a subset of anorexic patients is actually, you can read it as a slow life history marker. And then, of course, starvation will reduce serotonin because you get it from food. And so you have to make a distinction between an acute effect of starvation and a trait level neurobiological feature that fits this kind of model here. Yeah, I think we have time for so the autism spectrum is another extremely interesting condition. I think one of the most interesting evolutionary models that's been proposed in the last few years is the diametrical model of autism and psychosis by Crespi and Badcock. And there's considerable evidence from a number of different perspectives that autism spectrum disorders and psychosis spectrum disorders, including schizophrenia, are actually on two sides of a continuum. So there seem to be opposite correlations with number of traits, and some of the traits are psychological traits like visual spatial skills, imagination, attentional focus that tends to be restricted and intense in autistic people, but kind of diffuse and jumpy in people in the psychosis spectrum. But there's also correlations, for example, with early brain growth, birth weight, fetal development rates. And autism spectrum disorders tend to be correlated with overgrowth early in development. Very interesting. Whereas schizophrenia spectrum disorders tend to correlate with undergrowth early on. Yes?
Could you clarify what you mean by overgrowth?
Oh, overgrowth, it could be, for example, faster growth in infancy, head size at birth, length of the baby at delivery. I mean, people look at different things. Brain growth is especially strong. Of course, it all correlates to some extent. But for example, brain growth is one marker, and it's associated with autism spectrum. Early on, from childhood on, it becomes fuzzier. Okay, and there might be some inversion of some trends. But especially in early development, you find this. And there's some correlations with genes that genetic factors that seem to be diametrically associated. So, for example, gain of function mutations versus loss of function tend to shift in one direction or the other. Anyways, it's not just about physical growth. There's a case to be made that cognitive development in autism, to some extent, mirrors a delayed version of standard developmental trajectories and the maintenance of some traits that are typical of childhood. So there's a heterochrony, I'm saying it right, argument that's an interesting argument to be made about autistic traits. One thing that makes you think that autism as a constellation might actually include something adaptive, it's not all dysfunction, is that new genetic studies are actually starting to find genetic correlations between autism-related alleles and IQ, positive correlations. This is very unusual for mental disorders, one of the few. And this is more true for the common variants that contribute to autism risk. They also tend to be the same variants that correlate with higher IQ. And Crespi recently argued that autism disorders might be, this is a speculative model, but they could be kind of a side effect, byproduct, or recent selection for intelligence, and particularly some aspects of intelligence that relate to visual spatial skills, systematic problem solving, and so forth. But be as it may, another puzzling finding in the psychiatric genetic literature is that if you take autism as a whole, there's clearly a role for rare mutations, plausibly deleterious mutations that contribute to autism risk, especially when it's associated with low IQ and intellectual deficit and so forth. But there's also a fairly substantial role of common genetic variants, especially in what we used to be called the high functioning spectrum, or the Asperger spectrum of autism. And that suggests that there might be some interesting heterogeneity from a strategic perspective. And very briefly, autistic-like traits, they're also this kind of counterintuitive, associated to some behavioral differences in mating patterns. And we did we collected some evidence about mating effort and indicators of long-term investment in partners. And basically what you find is that people with autistic-like traits in normal range, so no diagnosis here, they tend to invest more in long-term mating, less in short-term mating. There's higher moral and sexual disgust, which is also kind of a correlate of life histories, low impulsivity, and a constellation of traits that fits the prediction for the skill provisioning profile I was talking about. So the general idea, putting this together, I'm proposing that you can actually make an interesting functional distinction within autism. Essentially two overlapping subtypes. These are overlapping because they really come from different pathways and they can occur at the same time. So they're not mutually exclusive at all. And there's some overlap between high-functioning autism versus severe autism with intellectual disability, although the overlap is only going to be approximate. But the idea is that slow-spectrum ASD actually corresponds to some extent to the high-functioning versions, where you have more common variants, more strategic variation, and, for example, things like overgrowth in early development and long intervals between pregnancies. That's also kind of a risk factor, a weak risk factor for autism, but you find that. While on the other hand, you have what I'm calling the other type, for lack of better word, but basically it's a subtype that doesn't fit any of the three categories, where you don't expect as strong a male prevalence, okay, and in fact you don't, and you expect a stronger role of deleterious mutations, stronger association with, for example, paternal age. It's a mutation marker, and so forth. And the idea here is that autistic-like traits in the normal range are actually a slow life history variant. Simon Baron-Cohen argued that they are autism and autistic traits are the extreme male brain. My argument would be that's one type of extreme male brain. Psychopaths are another kind of extreme male brain. Probably some schizotypal personalities are also more extremely male. So males have a range of funny extreme brains which correlate with different types of disorders. But autism is just one of those extremes. And there's an interesting step you can make. All the data on early overgrowth, long interpregnancy interval, and so forth, actually that makes quite a bit of sense in a life history perspective, because those are, in the animal literature, those are just markers of maternal investment. Okay? So fetal growth, short interval between pregnancy or longer, those are actually traits that fit into this framework. And within what I'm calling low spectrum ASD, I'm proposing there's now a gradient. It's not all adaptive. There's an adaptive background in these personality variations, but then there's definitely room for frankly maladaptive variants that might have to do with overexpression. And assortative mating is actually pretty high in autism for diagnosed people. So that's one pathway where you can get beyond the fitness optimum and just down the cliff. And the what I'm calling OASD is a very different kind of condition, which reflects mainly harmful dysfunction driven by deleterious mutations. And this is it. Okay, so there's another similar approach in psychopathology that tries to link big patterns of comorbidity in mental disorders to broad dimensions of individual differences. This is usually called a transdiagnostic model. Standard version is internalizing-externalizing factors. Internalizing is essentially anxiety and depression and fear, and the externalizing is aggression, impulsivity, drug dependence, and so forth. And recently, data are accumulating that there's also, you can actually, from factor analysis, identify a general, what they're calling P factor, a general factor that increases risk for all types of psychopathology, independent of what. It's kind of general predisposition to all sorts of mental disorders. And basically what I'm proposing is that what looks like, this is a very interesting prediction, based on this model, what looks like a unitary factor in factor analysis, this P factor for all sorts of psychopathology, is actually the result of three different sources of variation that are largely functionally and also statistically independent. And these are fast life histories, defense upregulation, and low cognitive ability. This is the prediction I'm making. So I'm saying what looks like a unitary factor is not a unitary factor. It's kind of a statistical aggregate that comes from 3 semi-independent sources of variation. Can I support that? And this is where I took a very roundabout way of testing this idea. And the idea was to simulate. The data we have in psychopathology, they're usually not that fine-grained, so you can't really make distinctions between, for example, subtypes of disorders. What you can do, though, is to simulate psychopathology data based on the model. So assuming that the FSD model is correct, let's generate some putative symptom scores for large samples of people. We do the same kind of analysis people are doing with the real data on psychopathology, and we compare the results and see if we get the same thing. Do we get a p-factor, just a general p-factor, even if there's no general factor in the data? And it turns out, OK, I'll skip the details, but basically this is a simulation, and the structural part of the simulation is they're just weight, plus and minus weights based on where the disorders are on the various categories. These are the results. So this is compared to the famous study by Caspi et al. Model fit, we test different factor models. On the this is all with the simulated data. Do we choose the same model they chose? And in the empirical data, this model fits marginally better, and is the selected one is same in the simulated data. Factor congruence. So we do find a p-factor. So if you do factor analysis on this data, even there's no p-factor in the generating structure, you find it. Very interesting. And the factor congruence, so which items tend to load on it, they're actually pretty similar, very high, even from the simulated data. And finally, there's one weird pattern that those authors found in the empirical data that's basically the internalizing and externalizing symptoms, they tend to correlate in a positive way when you don't have a general factor. The moment you include a general factor, the correlation becomes negative. And they interpret this with sex differences and other things. And actually what I show is that this is actually what you get from this life history model. So again, this is not proving that the model is the right one, but at least it shows that if the structure of psychopathology is influenced by these big distinctions I'm proposing, if you analyze the data, you will find what people are finding in the real world. So I think there's room for more research and definitely encouraging results. So in conclusion, we may be able to move beyond fragmentation in evolutionary psychopathology. That's the main message. I haven't talked about it too much, but there's a potential. This kind of model actually opens the way for deeper integration with behavior genetics, because now you can start mapping sources of genetic variation on functional dimensions, and better integration with individual differences, which is kind of one of the weak spots of evolutionary psychopathology right now. There's the foundation, at least the foundation, for an alternative classification system. This is really novel. And as I showed, the FSD model does reproduce the large-scale structure of mental disorders in the real world. And then, because life history theory is intrinsically developmental, okay, and you can make predictions about the kind of contextual and environmental factors that will influence the various trade-offs, you can actually draw a number of very interesting implications for epidemiology and developmental psychopathology. And that's it.